Imagine for a moment that you woke up one day and all of the food in your refrigerator had gone bad. It's black, it's mushy, and the smell is horrific, like death. So you clean out your refrigerator and you move on. You have dry goods. But the food in your pantry has also gone bad, black, slimy, and smelly. Only the canned goods are okay to eat, and you eat those for the next few days. Eventually, you consume all of your stock of canned goods. No problem. You go to the grocery store. But the grocery store has the same problem. All of their non-canned food turned black and foul. They were obliged to remove all of the bad food days ago. Now you find out that someone with much more money than you went into every grocery store and bought all of their canned goods. Next, you try the corner markets, vending machines, and fast food restaurants. We're a society that is surrounded by food. But those establishments are cleared out as well. The unsafe food was removed, and the safe food was completely bought out. Through the grapevine, you find out that you can purchase canned foods from the very person who has been buying them up, but now it will cost you the price of a new car for just 1 week's worth of groceries. And that isn't the kind of cheddar you have lying around. So now you have to work, and you will have to work harder than you have ever worked before. Right about this time, the effects of malnutrition are starting to hit you because you haven't had enough solid food to eat. You're weak and irritable, and your immune system has been compromised. In other words, you're not an ideal employee, and you're let go. You're left at home, weak, miserable, trying to scrape together enough money to pay the rent or mortgage. But your landlord is trying to get you to move out because you are behind on your rent, or the bank is trying to take back your home because you're late on your mortgage. Soon you're homeless, unemployed, and completely without hope. All because your food supply went bad. You are entirely dependent on charity, either from faith-based groups or the government. And any day, that source of income could dry up. But that would never happen, right? Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. Today we will discuss one of history's worst famines, the Great Irish Potato Famine. More than 1 million people died, either from starvation or disease as a result of the famine, and another 1 million fled to other countries. It left many parts of this small island nation deserted, and the migration of Irish out of Ireland continued in great numbers for the next several decades, effectively cutting the total population in half. As we see a similar mass exodus now taking place in Syria, we can draw comparisons between this great disaster in northwestern Europe and the current crisis in the Middle East. The potato. In some ways, it is a miracle food. Last year, the world produced over 368 million tons of potatoes. That would average out to 73 pounds of potatoes per person per year. It is one of the world's most popular crops. It is a cheap and plentiful crop that grows in almost any climate, making it an ideal staple for developing countries. It can also be cultivated more than once a year. It grows easily, even in inferior soils. Potatoes contain many important vitamins and minerals like vitamin B6, vitamin C, and potassium. It is also known for containing a great deal of starch, and they are an excellent source of fiber. Some research suggests that in the early 19th century, the average Irish male was healthier than the average English male, due in part to Ireland's potato-based diet. Just prior to the famine in Ireland, the potato had played an important part in the diet of most continental Europeans, and may help to explain why the population of Europe was exploding at that time. As popular as the potato was in post-Napoleonic Europe, the crop had been a relatively recent import from another continent. Potatoes were originally found only in the Andes Mountains of South America, where they had been cultivated by indigenous tribes for more than 7,000 years. Because it is such a hardy crop, it can grow at the extremely high altitudes where these people lived. The Spanish conquistadors who conquered Peru in 1536 were the first Europeans to encounter the potato, and they brought them back to Spain by the boatload. Basque farmers were soon growing them along the Biscay coast. In 1589, Sir Walter Raleigh brought the tuber to Ireland where its growth took off. Over the next 4 decades, potato fields spread out all over Europe. Potatoes were easier to grow than wheat or oats and contained most of the vitamins needed for sustenance. 1 acre of potatoes could support 10 people. The potato, along with other agricultural advances, led to a huge burst in the population of Europe. But no country grew faster than Ireland. Between 1745 and 1800, the population doubled from 2.5 million to 5 million, and then it almost doubled again. By 1845, the population was 8.2 million. As you can imagine, with such rapid population growth, there was widespread poverty, too many mouths to feed, and an economy that was held back and hindered. But how did this happen? Ireland wasn't just a neighbor of Great Britain, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the planet at that time. It was part of Great Britain, yet the disparity between the two nations could not have been greater. Ireland has a long history. There is archaeological evidence of habitation going back 10,000 years. It carried on trade with the Roman colony of Britannia and became predominantly Christian in the 5th century. An era of Irish piracy was followed by Viking invasions in the 9th century. Ireland was then ruled by a number of rival kings, one of whom eventually sought the aid of the Normans in neighboring England. King Henry II landed with a large Norman army in 1171 and initiated a very long history of English governance in Ireland. The English expanded their control under the Tudor dynasty of Henry VIII, Elizabeth, and James I. By the 16th century, they had taken control of the central government. They initiated a policy of confiscation and colonization known as plantations. Protestant English and Scottish settlers took over the lands of the Irish Catholics. With little success, the English attempted to convert the Irish Catholics to Anglicanism under a series of penal laws. The penal laws also made it illegal for Catholics to bear arms, become officers in the army, serve in apprenticeships, and attend school or buy land. Those that did hold land were forced to divide it among their heirs after their death. This is called subdivision, and it created ever smaller plots for Irish landowners. In the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell brutally put down a rebellion, and what Catholic-held lands remained were given to British Protestants. Much of the land that was owned was held by absentee landlords living in England. Some absentee landlords managed their estates inefficiently, and food tended to be produced for export rather than for domestic consumption. 2 very cold winters near the end of the Little Ice Age led directly to a famine between 1740 and 1741, which killed about 400,000 people and caused over 150,000 Irish to leave the island. In addition, Irish exports were reduced by the Navigation Acts passed in the 1660s, which placed tariffs on Irish products entering England, but exempted English goods from tariffs on entering Ireland. The result of these laws and actions was the alienation of Irish Catholics from their Anglo-Irish landlords and the alienation of those landlords from their counterparts in England. In response, the Irish formed secret societies such as the Molly Maguires, the Ribbon Men, and the White Boys to counter English and Protestant influence in their country. The secret societies carried out raids in the dead of night, destroying the property of landlords, setting fires, and threatening Protestant lives. The result was that the landlords built ever greater households as far away from the Irish peasants as possible and spent as little time as necessary with their Irish house servants. Irish landowners were forced by the penal laws to subdivide their land as it passed down through the generations, but the majority of Irish peasants were tenants who had no land at all and were subject to the whim of the landlords. As the 19th century began, Ireland had an almost entirely agricultural economy, based upon a limited number of crops that would grow in that climate. Meanwhile, England was blazing the trail into the Industrial Revolution and advances in agriculture that were yielding ever greater crops. While England had a modern industrial economy, Ireland was still heavily dependent on growing its own food. The Napoleonic Wars actually brought relative prosperity to Ireland, as England was forced to import crops from its neighbor in order to feed its armies. During this time, many of the penal laws were repealed, and inspired by events in revolutionary France, the Irish began demanding more democratic reforms. But the situation took a turn when Irish Catholics persuaded France to land a large army in their country with the idea of kicking out the English. Storms destroyed the French fleet and the landing never took place. But the idea of another Catholic country coming to the aid of the Irish Catholics made the English more paranoid than ever. In 1798, British Army troops savagely crushed several rebellions by hanging, flogging, and torturing the rebels and rebel sympathizers. In 1801, the Act of Union was passed, abolishing the Irish Parliament and making Ireland part of Great Britain. Unlike Scotland and Wales, Ireland was never an equal partner, but the end result was that Britain was now responsible for the domestic affairs of Ireland. 100 former members of the Irish Parliament now took their seats in Westminster and represented their people's concerns there. In 1829, full Catholic emancipation was achieved, and a movement started to repeal the Act of Union. The era of prosperity during the wars on the continent came to an end in the 1830s as the price of grain went into free fall. Rents did not drop as fast as the price of crops, which led to tenants being forced onto smaller and smaller plots of land. This meant that as many as 1/3 of the population was forced to grow potatoes because they did not have enough land to successfully grow grain crops. By 1845, most of Ireland's rural population depended on potatoes as their staple food. From August until May, 6 million men, women, and children ate potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They boiled them, roasted them, and mashed them with buttermilk and onions. They ate potato pancakes, potato bread, and potato soup. They even fed their pigs and cows and chickens potatoes. In the 40 years that followed the Union, successive British governments grappled with the problems of governing a country which had, as Benjamin Disraeli put it in 1844, a starving population, an absentee aristocracy, and an alien church, and in addition the weakest executive in the world. One historian calculated that between 1801 and 1845 there had been 114 commissions and 61 special committees inquiring into the state of Ireland, and that without exception their findings prophesied disaster. Ireland was on the verge of starvation, her population rapidly increasing, 3/4 of her laborers unemployed, housing conditions appalling, and the standard of living unbelievably low. By the 1840s, Ireland had become entirely dependent on just one crop, and God help everyone if something were to happen to the potato. The weather in the summer of 1845 seemed unusual, off in some way. It started unseasonably cool and wet across Western Europe. On an almost daily basis, sheets of heavy rain came down, swelling rivers, blowing over trees and pummeling fields. Livestock huddled together and people kept indoors. By July, it had all changed. The days burned much hotter than usual, and the weather remained dry. In August, the heavy rains returned and fell for 3 straight weeks. Meanwhile, on a completely different continent, something was happening to the potato that would greatly affect the lives of millions of Irish. A blight known as Phytophthora infestans was taking hold of potatoes in Mexico, and may have started in South America. By 1844, Irish newspapers were carrying stories of the potato blight that was hitting the eastern United States and destroying potato crops there. It is believed that clipper ships traveling between Europe and the United States fed their passengers potatoes, and that it was on some of these potatoes that the blight was brought to Europe. Phytophthora infestans thrives in certain conditions, temperatures that are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity that is above 75% for 2 days or more. The blight spreads by way of spores in the same way that flowers use pollen to repopulate. Rain and wind help spread the spores, and that summer was characterized by plenty of both. The early stages of blight are easily missed. Symptoms include the appearance of dark blotches on the potato plant's leaf tips and stems, White mold will appear under the leaves in humid conditions, and the whole plant may quickly collapse. Infected tubers develop gray or dark patches that are reddish-brown beneath the skin and quickly decay to a foul-smelling mush caused by the infestation of bacterial rots. Seemingly healthy tubers may rot later when in storage. At that time in Ireland, potatoes were harvested twice each fall. The early crop, the new potatoes, were harvested in late August, and the old potatoes were lifted in October. Throughout the fall, the weather continued to behave strangely. Mornings were sunny and warm, but in the afternoon skies clouded over and heavy rain fell. On breezy days, the wind carried a strange odor. Farmers kept a close eye on their potatoes, but they seemed sturdy and healthy. One October evening, a thick blue fog covered the countryside. It was of a dark color never witnessed before, and many people went to bed fearing a great calamity was about to befall them. The next morning they were overwhelmed by a powerful stench emanating from the potato beds. Upon examination, the plants were covered with black spots, and the leaves and stalks hung down as if dead. The farmers and laborers tried desperately to save the potatoes, lighting fires to purify the air. But when the potatoes were dug up, they were rotten, black, and slimy, unfit for consumption. The tubers had died in the ground. Mass panic had not set in. After all, the August crop of new potatoes looked fine, and they were being stored underground in great pits to be eaten slowly over the long winter. But soon news was spreading that even these potatoes that went into the storage pits healthy were being pulled out black and rotting. Farmers and laborers would be hit the hardest, but they represented 3/4 of Ireland's population. They depended on the potato harvest to carry them through winter and spring, and then spend the difficult summer months rummaging through discards and eating available foods with little nutritional value. The men and boys would often leave their farms and cottages to seek work in the cities abroad. Following the dreadful October harvest, men, women, and children scoured the fields, roadsides, and ditches for weeds, nettles, and cabbage leaves. They dug for turnips that were missed during the harvest. They picked over discarded and half-eaten vegetables, looking for edible pieces to take home. Some people would forage at night to hide the shame and stigma of not being able to provide for their families. When one farmer investigated a suspicious sound in his garden, he discovered his neighbor digging up his turnips. Dismayed, the farmer asked him, "Why do you come by night to take what I would gladly have given by day?" The neighbor responded, "I was too ashamed to let anyone know I was in such want." Young men banded together in groups. They would walk for miles searching for herds of cattle. Once they found a herd, they would corner a cow. While a couple men would hold down the cow, another man would cut a vein in its neck and drain off a few pints of blood into a leather pouch, and then pinch the incision closed. The men took this blood back to their wives, who would fry it with mushrooms and cabbages or cook it into a black pudding. The blood often served as a substitute for meat. Others would steal the tails of young cows and skin them and roast them. As winter approached and the cost of flour, oatmeal, and other foods skyrocketed, the merchants and shopkeepers had bought up the flour and oatmeal and were selling it in small quantities at double the cost. Facing starvation and eviction, many Irish peasants began selling their furniture, bedding, and extra clothing. Next, they sold the items they could not really afford to lose: pigs, chickens, cows, their work tools, and fishing nets. When they ran out of items to sell, they borrowed from moneylenders called gambeen men. These gambeen would often charge outrageous interest rates from 20 to 50%. Eventually, what little money they gathered from pawning their valuables and taking out loans would get spent on food. At this point, many begged their churches and government officials for a little bit of charity. Often British officials denied the severity of the problem. They claimed that the Irish had always had a tendency toward exaggeration. Others criticized the Irish for bringing the problem upon themselves. They didn't work hard enough, they married too young, and depended too much on the potato. Some even said this was an act of God intended to reduce the Irish population to sustainable levels. Most of the poor Irish managed to find a way to survive the year of 1845. That would not necessarily be the case of 1846. That year the blight attacked even more viciously than the year before. 3/4 of the crop was ruined overnight, and many people lost their entire crop. 15-year-old Diarmid O'Donovan Rosa told of the time he went to dig up potatoes on their hill with his younger brother. "We dug for over 200 yards a piece of ridge, and all the potatoes I picked after him would not fill a skillet. They were no larger than marbles." A traveling priest reported devastation everywhere. The wretched people were sitting on fences of their decaying gardens, wringing their hands and wailing bitterly the destruction that had left them foodless. Hunger spread quickly, and it grew worse as families desperately tried to save what they could of their potatoes by peeling away the rotten sections, grating and boiling what remained, and making it into box tea bread or potato pancakes. This last-ditch effort at trying to find scraps of edible food from what remained brought on the first illnesses of the famine, potentially fatal stomach cramps and dysentery. With their animals sold or slaughtered in the previous year, the poor scoured the beaches for limpets, a type of snail, seaweed, and whatever the countryside had to offer, weeds, roots, nettles, flowers, and the remnants of animal feed. But for most it was insufficient. Conditions grew worse by the day. Those affected the most grew weak and became vulnerable to diseases such as scurvy, cholera, typhoid, relapsing fever caused by tick and louse bites, and an eye ailment called xerophthalmia, which causes a drying of the cornea and often leads to blindness. Some of these diseases were a secondary cause of the potato blight. Starving and exhausted people were unable to clean their homes, their bedding, and their cooking utensils, as well as themselves. Lice, ticks, and other vermin attacked, and for those with compromised immune systems it often meant death. The weakening and the sickness of the peasantry led to other problems. Members of the middle class often came into contact with the poor and sick, such as physicians, clergymen, and public workers. They often contacted contagions from the sick and starving. But the greatest problem facing the wealthier classes was due to the economics of a starving poor class. Thousands of tenant farmers and their families lost their cottages and bits of land when they were too ill and weak to plant crops for their landlords. Since they were using crops to pay their rents, landlords began evicting their tenants in great numbers. The evicted often found themselves crowded into public workhouses, facilities built by the British government to provide beds for the ill and destitute in exchange for physical labor. By early 1847, the workhouses were filled to capacity and were recording 3,000 deaths a week. Death now seemed to be everywhere. In 1846, a city official from Cork described the following scene of horror when he entered one peasant hut. 6 famished, ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed to be a ragged horse-cloth, and their wretched legs hanging about, naked above the knees. I approached in horror and found by a low moaning that they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had been a man. In time, Ireland became a vast graveyard, a graveyard of pits where the dead were wrapped in sheets and covered over with dirt once the country's supply of caskets ran out. There they had to remain until full burial was possible. Animals soon discovered these unburied corpses and began to feast. There were even reports of cannibalism. Sextons were no longer able to keep up with the number of burials, and there was a shortage of coffins. In some counties they came up with the solution of a coffin with a hinged base, which could be opened to let the dead body slide into the grave, and the coffin could be reused again. Mourners stopped attending funerals, probably because they were too weak to do so. For people who had placed such emphasis on the ceremonies surrounding death, this represented an appalling lack of ceremony. They were filled with a dreadful despair which lasted long after the famine had ended. So what was the government response to these horrible conditions? Well, the government was Great Britain, because the Act of Union now meant that all of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and that government was located one island over to the east in London. The British Prime Minister at that time was Sir Robert Peel. Peel, a member of the Conservative Party, had experience with Irish famines when he was Secretary to Ireland, and there was a food crisis there in 1816. He understood how bad famine could make things. Starving people resort to crime, rioting, and rebellion. Also, weak people, unable to properly care for themselves, were prime victims for disease. Peel was convinced that the British government needed to provide relief even if it was for purely its own self-interest. But Peel was also cautious. After all, he was a conservative, and that's what conservatives are known for. He dispatched a scientific commission to Ireland to determine if this potato blight was really real and not some fancy Irish tale. It didn't take long for the commission to determine that, yes, the potatoes really were black, and yes, the potatoes really were inedible. But the commission wanted to know, just how inedible were these black potatoes? So, using the most advanced scientific knowledge available during the mid-19th century, these great scientists determined that black doesn't always mean black. They instructed the Irish farmers and laborers to dry the blighted potatoes in the sun, dig new storage pits, and fill these pits with lime, sand, turf, and sawdust before throwing the potatoes in. Then make certain to ventilate the potatoes with metal rods. You're still dying from eating black potatoes, you say? Try this. Separate the really black potatoes from the not-so-black potatoes, then cut the nasty bits out of the not-so-black potatoes, grate in a tub, wash and strain through cloth, dry out, and then cook over a griddle for 20 minutes. Delicious, right? No? You're still dying? This is going to be a tough nut to crack. Peel threw in the towel on the effort to save the black potatoes. His next move was to find a way around Britain's prohibitive corn laws. Here in America and in several other English-speaking countries, we think of corn as that yellow stuff that grows on a cob and is used to make popcorn. But in Britain and Ireland, corn means grain. It could be wheat or oat or barley, but it is all corn. The corn laws protected British farmers from that most terrible kind of corn, imported corn. Because why go to the trouble of having a laissez-faire economy in which you let the market do what it wants to do if you can't use the government to control prices? Which is what they did by making the foreign corn more expensive than the domestic corn through taxation. This method of price control kept the price of domestic corn high because the corn merchants weren't concerned about outside competition. The net effect was that the poor could not afford to eat, and the Irish poor did not have the option of growing their own food. So Peel tried to repeal the corn laws. Clever, no? Parliament didn't think so. They voted against Peel and repeal, and the corn laws stayed on the books. Peel's next move was to find a loophole, and he did. This stuff that Americans call corn, that we call Indian corn or maize, he said, isn't grown in Britain. Therefore, it is not prohibitively taxed. We can import cheap maize from the United States and feed it to the starving Irish. Great plan, right? Well, corn on the cob doesn't stay fresh long enough for the transatlantic journey, so it has to be dried into kernels. That way it can be stored for very long periods of time. Peel purchased the maize in winter and stored it in depots at Cork and Limerick for the spring, when food supplies would be at their lowest. Many people died of starvation during the long, hard winter, but by March there was corn. But we know from more recent experiences in Ethiopia and Somalia that in a famine, relief supplies don't always make it to the people who need it most. In Potato Famine Ireland, the wealthier peasants bought up all of the supplies of maize, leaving the poor with nothing. Then these not-so-poor Irish found out that maize is very difficult to turn into food without the proper grinding equipment, which they didn't have. The result was that no matter how the maize was prepared, it was too hard and too sharp to pass through a person's intestines. The end result was that many people died eating the imported American corn. Peel's next effort was a massive public works project. Hundreds of thousands of poor, starving people were put to work building roads, bridges, harbors, and fisheries. Little did it matter if Ireland actually had a need for all of these things. Bridges were built that went to nowhere, roads were built that terminated in bogs or fields, and railroad tracks were put down where there was no use for them. But the people were employed, and the British taxpayer was not overburdened because the Irish landowners were forced to pay for it all. But the money earned by the laborers turned out to be too little to purchase food for an entire family, and the hard work only made those suffering from malnutrition weaker and sicker. Perhaps worst of all, the pay was often late. many times several weeks late. Thousands of hard-working people died while waiting to be paid. Peel was eventually turned out of office and replaced by Lord John Russell of the Liberal Party, not so much out of Irish resentment of his misguided relief efforts, so much as British resentment of his skirting the Corn Laws. Lord Russell was an even more ardent admirer of laissez-faire. He put an end to the public works projects, throwing 500,000 Irish out of work, closed down the soup kitchens, which were feeding 3 million starving Irish a day, and stopped the importation of American corn, of which the Irish were finally learning how to make edible. Let the market work its magic, was Lord Russell's theme. There's magic, there's black magic, and then there's black potato magic. The blight hit a second year, even more devastating than the first. People who had sold all of their valuables just to raise a new crop of potatoes now had no valuables and no potatoes. While this was happening, millions of tenant farmers were working the wheat, oat, barley, and rye fields of their landlords. But they could eat none of the food that they harvested. The tenant farmers worked long days just to keep up with their rent, while the landlords shipped their grain over to England where it could fetch a higher price. In the midst of plenty, and some researchers claim there was more than enough grain to feed everyone in Ireland, the starving watched the food they harvested get sent abroad. Just as Peel had feared, starving peasants began to riot. The British Army was called in, and force was used to put a halt to the riots. The soup kitchens, public work projects, and government corn were quickly brought back. Money was running out for the small farmers and tenant laborers, but it was also running out for the landlords. Remember, the landlords were forced to bear the cost of the soup kitchens, workhouses, and public work projects. The landlords were getting squeezed by starving tenants and a demanding British government. One of these landlords, William Gregory, called for, and the Parliament passed, what came to be called the Gregory Clause. Under this clause, any tenant who owned more than a quarter of an acre of land was denied government relief. No workhouse, no soup kitchen, no corn. And if you're sick, no hospital. Since the landlords were being taxed based on the number of tenants on their farms, it was in their interest to remove as many tenants as possible. It also meant that the freed-up land could be used for less labor-intensive practices such as pasture land. All one had to do was to remove the stubborn, starving tenants. Many landlords, facing eviction themselves or just looking to make some profit, contacted the local sheriff's office and requested to have their tenants forcibly removed. On eviction day, the sheriff and his crew of men would visit the tenant's house armed with crowbars and often backed by British soldiers. The sheriff would then demand that the tenant leave or face forced removal. It did not matter how old or sick or weak the tenant was, they were thrown out into the cold. In the town of Kilrush, 30-year-old Bridget O'Donnell was 7 months pregnant, sick with fever, and caring for her 3 young children. When the sheriff called her name, she refused to leave. The sheriff and his crew battered down the front door and used rope to pull down the roof and walls of her cabin. Bridget survived the ordeal, but her unborn baby and 13-year-old son did not. In this manner, more than 250,000 lost their homes. They had half of it knocked down, Bridget said, when the neighbors, women, carried me out. Not that many Irish left their homeland during the first year of the famine. There was too much to leave behind. Their family, their friends, their culture, their faith. But by 1846, a number of factors came together that led to the Great Push. First, as the homeless and starving left their homes and towns to seek work where it was available, they brought disease with them, spreading from just 11 counties to all of Ireland. Second, the potato crop of 1846 and 47 initially appeared healthy and free of blight, but later turned out to be more devastating than the year before. Third, the winter of that year would be one of the coldest and snowiest on record. Those who were already weak from malnutrition grew weaker or died. Finally, add to all that the landlords who were evicting their tenants in order to make their holdings profitable again, and you have the recipe for a massive wave of emigration. 106,000 left the country in 1846, and double that number in 1847. For the next 4 years, about 200,000 people were leaving the country annually. Almost 1.2 million left during the years of the famine, out of a home population of 8 million that was itself rapidly dwindling due to the effects of starvation. The main destination for the Irish fleeing the famine were English-speaking nations. England, Wales, and Scotland were popular because they were less than a one-day journey away. However, for many Irish, those countries were just a stopping point. They were eager to get away from the British Empire. For that reason, Canada was not as popular a destination as it could have been. Canada was still very British at that time, and where it wasn't British, its citizens spoke mostly French. Australia was actually anxious to have new settlers. The population at that time was predominantly male, and the Australian government actively recruited female immigrants from Ireland, often sponsoring the cost of their passage. But Australia is much, much farther away from Ireland than the Americas. That meant a much more expensive fare for those who were not sponsored and a much longer trip by sea. For those reasons, and because the United States was looking for a steady supply of cheap labor at the time, America was the prime destination for Irish immigrants. As much as 3/4 of those who left Ireland during the famine headed to America. Scraping together the money to afford passage wasn't easy for the many people who were having a difficult time finding enough to eat. But seeing their limited options clearly, many managed to scrimp and save what they could. Others were funded by their landlords, who were only too happy to pay for their voluntary removal. Some were funded by the British government or various charities. But most received aid from their families, particularly those that had already made the transatlantic trip and were doing well enough that they could send more back to the homeland. Fare from Ireland to New York was usually about £2 to £5, or about $4,000 to $10,000 in today's U.S. currency. Remember, people were getting paid pennies for a full day of labor at that time. That fare would generally get you a bunk in steerage, down in the deepest hold of the ship, and often the ships themselves were designed to carry cargo. Until 1850, when steamships were introduced, these were sailing ships. If the wind wasn't blowing, passengers might have to wait days for favorable conditions, eating through their scant rations. Once aboard, passengers were crowded as close together as possible on narrow wooden berths with no room to turn over. Toilets were filthy and few and far between. The odor, as one could imagine, was horrendous, and passengers tended to stay above deck as much as possible during their waking hours. Violent storms meant battening down the hatches, and one could only imagine how much worse things must have been once people started to get seasick. The voyage usually took about 40 days, but bad weather or lack of wind could delay the journey. Eventually, the British and American governments forced the shipping lines to provide food for starving passengers, but crews were forced to cut back when there were delays so that food supplies would not run out before they reached land. Ships sailing to Canada were often called coffin ships. They took on numbers of passengers that were far above the legal limit, carried insufficient rations of food and water, and did not conduct proper medical examinations for travelers carrying disease. Sick passengers who arrived in Canada were often quarantined in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Of the 100,000 immigrants who headed to Canada, about 20,000 died before getting settled down. But this did not deter later immigrants. During the famine, entire villages and towns were deserted. The landlords were happy to clear their lands of tenants, and British officials were happy to see Ireland being depopulated. By 1848, rebellions and uprisings were occurring all over the European continent for a variety of reasons, and the British government was not eager to see the same thing happen in Ireland. That year, a new movement began called the Young Islanders. They were a diverse group, rich and poor, Catholic and Protestant, urban and rural. They all wanted one thing, to make Ireland independent of Great Britain. Their hope was to find a peaceful solution, but their hand was forced at Ballingarry in County Tipperary. A group of them had about 46 British police holed up in a farmhouse. But reinforcements later arrived and the British were able to clear out the rebels, shooting a few in the process. This event would later be known as the Battle of Widow McCormack's Cabbage Plot. It marked the first time the Irish tricolor flag of green, white, and orange, a gift from France, was flown, and it also marked the beginning of a very long conflict between Irish seeking independence and British authorities. In 1849, the potato blight struck once again, but it was not as widespread as it had been the years before. By 1850, the potato crop was mostly free of blight. That same year, voting rights were extended to the smaller farmers, and this gave them more of a say in government policy. By 1853, Britain cancelled the £4 million debt owed by the Irish landlords for the cost of famine relief. There would be many more problems that would hit Ireland over the next 50 years, including several more cases of blight. By 1900, the population of Ireland had been cut to 4 million, or half of what it had been prior to the famine. As many as 4 million Irish immigrated to the various English-speaking nations of the world. It is thought that more than 1 million died during the famine, either from starvation or disease. If you live in a nation with a substantial population of people with Irish ancestry, it is most likely because of the famine. The rebellions continued after McCormick's plot, and in 1921 Ireland gained its independence from Britain, or at least 26 of the 32 counties did. But the Troubles, as they came to be called, continued through the 20th century between the British and the Irish, this time focusing on the 6 counties that stayed British and came to be called Northern Ireland. In the last few years, both sides have put aside their differences, and Ireland has become a prosperous nation. Much of the Irish potato famine could have been prevented or mitigated. Reliance on the potato, forcing poor landowners to subdivide their plots, the exporting of homegrown grain, and England's difficult relationship with a nation it had subsumed but refused to take full responsibility for, were all human forced errors. But the greatest indignity may have been Britain's determination to stick to laissez-faire principles which clearly do not work in times of disaster. Weak people were forced to work. Starving subsistence farmers were forced to continue to rely on the potato. Soup kitchens were prematurely closed, and Irish landowners who were barely getting by were forced to pay for all assistance. All of this while Britain was prospering and booming. Charles Dickens did not have to look very far for inspiration for his stories. In psychology, this is called disassociation. It is an emotional detachment from immediate problems, and in this instance, it was absolutely devastating for the Irish. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. If you're interested in history, there are a number of fantastic podcasts that you can listen to in addition to this one. Thomas Daly hosts American Biography, a look at American history that examines the lives of influential Americans. Chris Stewart examines the Middle Kingdom and its 5,000-year history in the history of China. Travis Dow looks at the fascinating history of the German people in the History of Germany podcast. Benjamin Jacobs dives into the history of the Protestant Reformation in Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation. 2 longtime history podcast favorites are Mike Duncan's Revolutions and Robin Pearson's amazing History of Byzantium, which examines what happened to the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire fell. Spoiler alert, it didn't fall when we think it did. If you're interested in more history podcasts, then I urge you to go to www.historypodcasters.com. And there you will learn about many of the history podcasts that are available on iTunes, Stitcher, and many other networks. Next time we will look at the Reverend Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre in Guyana. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.